An import fighter is quite simply a car designed to compete in a segment perceived as controlled by one or more imports. Originally, this of course meant something from Europe. Not that any European cars were dominant in any American market at the time, but they did have different styling and a certain amount of prestige, often for no other reason than being European. They were typically rare, and therefore had a certain exotic appeal to them. That didn't stop American designers from taking inspiration from them. One of the earliest I can think of is Edsel Ford's Lincoln Continental. Introduced for 1940, it had a lower belt line than other Lincolns and no running boards, a look that was inspired by European designs. But at 2 tons and powered by a V12, it was unlikely to be mistaken for an import, although the look may have contributed to its success, and would inspire other lower belt line luxury cars, such as the Buick Skylark and Cadillac Eldorado. But it was a look soon abandoned on all 3 models. The Studebaker Loewy Coupe of 1953 was styled by Raymond Loewy, who was a European industrial designer. It wasn't the first American car he designed, having produced designs for Hupmobile 2 decades earlier, and it wasn't even the first Studebaker he was involved in designing. But this was a radical departure from American designs at the time, being lower and sleeker than just about anything on the road. What it wasn't, however, was competing against cars imported from Europe, which were not terribly popular in the US at the time. There was, however, a growing interest in sports cars, which led to what might be the first true import fighter that same year, the Corvette. Although initially the Corvette didn't take the role too seriously. It used a standard Chevrolet chassis and engine, although with a noticeable increase in horsepower, and the only transmission was a 2-speed automatic. But soon, V8s and manual transmissions would turn it into a real performer, and it has been the default American sports car ever since, often competing with European cars twice its price. Oddly, the Mustang, which may be considered one of the most American cars ever, initially tried to seem European. At its introduction, it was one of America's smallest cars, with fake side scoops and a mesh grille. It was supposed to resemble a European sports car, having a radical look that caught people off guard. But it increasingly gained weight and cubic inches, until there was no doubt that it was pure American. Import fighters generally tend to be in the small car segments, where profits are often low. One could suggest the original Nash Rambler of 1950 was one such car, but it wasn't so much designed to compete with smaller imports, but to fill the gap between them and the American cars. Chevrolet's rear-engine air-cooled Corvair took inspiration from an import with similar engineering, but its competition was still other American brands, as the Corvair's total U.S. sales would surpass the Beetle in just over a year. The Ford Pinto and Chevrolet Vega were clearly aimed at the growing import market. With 4-cylinder engines, they were tiny by American standards, but fairly average-sized among many imports of the time. And although both would develop reputations for quality issues, they would also outsell all their import competition. The AMC Hornet and Gremlin certainly seemed more European-looking than their Big 3 counterparts, but they also would both be available with V8s, something unlikely to be found in similarly sized, or certainly priced, European cars, although later Gremlins would be marketed directly towards the Volkswagen. It was also around this time that the so-called captive imports were gaining popularity, effectively marketing imports under domestic brands, which doesn't really qualify as fighting imports. The Cadillac Seville of 1975 was very specifically an import fighter at its introduction, aimed at the big Mercedes. Although based on the humble Nova, and being the smallest Cadillac, it was far from the cheapest. Critics were impressed, and it was considered a success, and would inspire American copycats, which may explain why it went a different direction with its second generation. But other similarly sized cars of the same period also showed European influences, with better equipped packages. Cars such as the Plymouth Valiant Brougham, Dodge Dart Special Edition, Chevrolet Nova Concours, and Pontiac Ventura SJ, which saw enough success for the trend to carry into new arrivals, from the Ford Granada and Mercury Monarch, which were also marketed at Mercedes, to the Dodge Diplomat and Chrysler LeBaron, which seemed to fit into a segment of their own. Many people believe the downsizing trend of the late 70s was in response to imports, but it was more of a regulated move. Regulations that added weight while forcing improvements in mileage and emissions, requiring a move to smaller cars. And at the time, American cars remained at the top of the segment, with such cars as the Chevrolet Cavalier and Ford Escort taking the lead in sales, and GM's J-body cars seeing success on a global scale and selling through all GM divisions, both in and out of the U.S. And while the sales-leading Escort was considered a world car, American versions were noticeably different from European versions. Cadillac would attempt to repeat their earlier success with the Seville by creating a car to compete with the small German cars. They started with the hugely successful J car and equipped it as one would expect a Cadillac to be equipped, calling it the Cimarron. But not only could it easily be mistaken for the cheaper Chevy, particularly the early versions, but it lacked the refinement, performance, and rear-wheel drive it needed to be competitive in the compact luxury segment, in spite of its premium price, meaning it would become the poster child of how not to make an import fighter. And although European brands were disappearing from the U.S. market, they still had an image American models attempted to replicate. So much so that Chevrolet created the Euro package, initially on the front-wheel drive Celebrity. It was little more than an appearance package, with alloy wheels and blacked-out trim, and later a full monochrome look and a manual transmission, meaning it wasn't all that Euro, but it was popular enough to carry over to the Lumina. The most serious import fighter would have to be Saturn. Saturn was not just a model, but a brand created specifically to compete with Asian imports, at least at first. Unlike Geo, which was just a bunch of Japanese cars sold under an American mark, although some were actually made in America. But at the end, Saturn had become nothing more than a way for GM to sell their European products in the U.S. Perhaps the earliest import fighters aimed at Japanese products were compact pickups, as the Mazda-built Ford Courier and Isuzu-built Chevy Love were replaced by the Ford Ranger and Chevy S10. The Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon were all but replicas of the original Volkswagen Golf, developed by Chrysler of Europe. Some early models even used the Volkswagen engine. But by 1981, Chrysler was using its own 84-horsepower 2.2-liter 4, when a Volkswagen GTI had 90 horsepower. And when Dodge made their hot hat version with Shelby, it quickly jumped to 110 horsepower. And then added a turbo, raising it to 146 horsepower, and then 175 horsepower with the addition of an intercooler, while the GTI was up to 123 horsepower. This not only put the Omni at a different level, with performance comparable to more exotic machines, but for some reason it was the beginning of Dodge becoming a major player in the so-called import motorsports events. Something that would continue through the turbocharged versions of the Shadow and the Neon SRT4, and in some cases would also include sedans, from the Turbo Lancer to the Spirit RT, perhaps partly due to confusion with the high volume of Mitsubishi-built and powered products. Cadillac would eventually bring the Seville back around to being an import fighter in the early 90s, once again critically acclaimed, but this time around buyers were less convinced. And since, Cadillacs have continued to try to compete with European sports sedans, often succeeding, even dropping out of the big luxury cruiser market they once dominated. But they are still haunted by that dated reputation. Traditionally, anything resembling a sports car or sports sedan would have been considered aimed at European products, and anything small and economical aimed at Asian products, although neither is really the case. Just as light trucks have not solely been the realm of American manufacturers. For example, although Jeep inspired the original Land Rover, it was clear that the Jeep Grand Cherokee took inspiration from the Range Rover, as Jeep began moving into the luxury SUV market, although I doubt there's much cross-shopping between the two. But with the market the way it is today, with American manufacturers all but abandoning the car markets, just about any new sedan could be considered an import fighter. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.